Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. We are at the home stretch of the MER and at the beginning of the spring seminar of the ARMA Chicago chapter. Before we get started with our next session, I just want to especially thank OpenText for making this next panel possible. So if you don't like what you hear, you can blame them. We have nothing to do with it. No. OpenText, we really appreciate your involvement. Also, just a reminder in case you haven't already heard, the next MER conference, 2020, May 4th through 6th, right here in this hotel in this great town, in this great city of Chicago. Please save the date. I hope to see all of you and many more on those days. Okay, so without further ado, it is time to start our panel discussion. We are living, as I said a couple of days ago, we are living in an amazing time. As we've seen over the last couple of days, there's incredible technological advances, incredible capabilities at all of our fingertips. But we're also living in a time when information, in many cases, can be questioned and questioned legitimately. Are the pictures that we're looking at real and authentic? Are the videos actually real that we're watching? Are the conclusions that we're drawing from our data the right conclusions? And on and on and on and on. This next panel is going to address the subject of information authenticity and what is our role as information governance practitioners, as information governance specialists, as information governance professionals. What is our role in ensuring that that information, that data is accurate, that it's authentic, that it hasn't been doctored, that it hasn't been manipulated incorrectly? Those are very deep questions, and I'm not even doing it justice. I'm going to introduce Mark Diamond, the CEO and founder of Contoural, who's going to lead us in an amazing panel discussion. He'll introduce our panelists. So Mark, the mic is yours. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this morning. I think saying this, we have an esteemed panel today is a bit of an understatement. Directly to my left, to your right, is Professor Michal Kosinski of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, which is an excellent talk from Michal. Sitting next to Michal is the honorary Peter Flynn. He is a retired judge with the Circuit Court of Cook County, still very active in the legal community. Judge Flynn, thank you very much for making some time to be able to join us today.
Could I just say, I was startled to hear that I had retired.
Oh.
It hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Although there are those who think it would be a good idea.
But Judge, I read it on the internet. It must be true. No.
Good point.
Thank you for correcting me. We have a presiding judge today who's going to do that. I guess I have to be even more careful. And next to him is we have Stuart Myles at the end there. Stuart is with the Associated Press. He's Director of Information Management. His job is to collect metadata associated with that so he can improve the readership experience for all the customers of Associated Press. So we're represented by the academia, the judiciary, by the press. And then right next to him, not last but not least, we have Mike Safar. Mike is Director of Product Management for OpenText. Mike has been involved in information governance for literally his entire career and on the technology side. So I think we have an outstanding panel. We're going to open it to questions a little bit, but I want to kick it off by asking a question, and I'm going to go through. Professor Kosinski, one of the big issues has been fake news out there. Is the news real out there, or have we lost? You said the end of privacy. Is this sort of the end of news?
Well, I think that fake news is certainly not fake news. So that's a fact that not all of the stories that you read on the internet, or all the information you read on the internet, or in the press, or in the books, or that you hear from others are necessarily true. But I think that a key question here to ask is whether the situation is getting worse or better. Because of course, fake news have have been there 10 years ago and 100 years ago and 2,000 years ago as well. And I think that there is growing evidence that, in fact, we're the best informed people that ever lived. Not only we have the most information, but also the largest fraction of this information is, in fact, valid. So what I'm thinking is happening, and there's a growing evidence, growing scientific evidence for that, is that we got so good at debunking fake news. Now we have fact-checking services. We have access to diverse information. We're not limited just to what our government or corporate-controlled media is telling us. We got so good at it that we are just surrounded by the constant popping noise of the fake stories that got debunked. And this creates an illusion, this cleaning up process creates an illusion that somehow the situation is getting worse. And it's a bit like, imagine that the diagnostic tools for detecting cancer suddenly got 2 times better. What you would see tomorrow is to be 2 times more cases,
So
or
do you
more
think
cases
the
of
news
cancer.
is getting worse or not?
I think that news are getting better.
Okay.
Or at least the information that we have, and this is actually a very well-documented fact, that we are the best informed people that have ever lived. So even if there's, with one click you can access a vast ocean of fake stories, on average humans got much better informed than they used to be 10 or 20 years ago.
Interesting, interesting. Judge Flynn, much of what you do is to look at the facts surrounding a particular matter. And ostensibly, one of the jobs of jurisprudence is examine the facts and apply the law associated with that. How, in this age of all this information and fake news, how, from a legal perspective, how do the courts really look at authenticity?
Well, we begin by accepting that information is always imperfect. Let me give you an example. When I was a kid, we used to say, I saw it with my own eyes. This was the gold standard, right? Today, we spend a certain amount of time in a lot of trials figuring out how much time we're going to give to the scientific debunking of eyewitness testimony, which is in fact less reliable than a lot of other things. So in a sense, Dr. Kosinski is exactly right. We have the tools with which to discern authenticity, which overlaps with reliability pretty well. We don't always use them too well. Remember the statistic just a couple of years ago that fully 1/3 of the US thought that weapons of mass destruction had been discovered in Iraq? There's a statistic today that something like 1/3 of the electorate think that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and so on and so on and so on. We may have a lot of very accurate information out there. We're not necessarily using it too well. So there's 2 things we do in the legal system about that. The first thing we do is we don't find facts, we find probabilities. The standard of proof isn't this is true. The standard of proof is, based on the information we have, it is more probable than not that whatever it is. He ran into a telephone pole or whatever have you. That tends to keep us honest, because it tends to remind us that we don't have 100% of the information, which is what I meant when I said all information is necessarily imperfect. The third thing is the motto on the Supreme Court building in Springfield, audi alteram partem, means listen to the other side. We think half a loaf is worse than none when it comes to information, because half a loaf means we're only getting one side of the story, and the only thing we can be really sure of is there's another side out there, and we better find out what it is and listen to it. This is why cross-examination is important. We don't take one side of the story without poking at it to see if it collapses when you really look at it carefully. Take those 3 things together, we're a system of skeptics. As long as we continue to be a system of skeptics, we'll make mistakes, but we'll be careful. And we'll do the best we can to get the most accurate we can.
Do you think it's getting easier? I mean, you can argue that there is more information today than there was, for example, when you started on the bench, a decade and a half ago in terms of doing that. Sitting on the bench, there's more information coming out there. Do you feel like your job is easier because there's more information, or is it more difficult because there may be more that you have to sort through, and again, as you say, assign probabilities associated with that?
It depends on the information and the nature of the problem. In some ways, it's easier because the systemic skepticism tends to mean that when you have a jury sitting in the box, they know already that they should wait until they hear everything before they decide the case. And that's really helpful. It's also helpful to remind us of that. On the other hand, you have to manage the information flow. You can't have a trial of a single hit and run case that takes 6 weeks because we haven't the time for that. So the system confronts there the same kind of information overload that you and I do in our daily lives. You can't read every newspaper that's out there. It's not possible. So you distill, you edit, and you try to make sure that what you've got is balanced. Audi alteram partem is the key to that. Listen to the other side. If the only thing you've got is one side, you're in trouble. Judges have a daily reminder of that when an emergency walks into the courtroom. My favorite example is the guy comes into the court and he says, "Judge, you have to do something. The city is out there at my 300-year-old oak tree, and they have chainsaws, and the chainsaws are running." Well, the natural instinct of any judge is, we'll tell him to stop for a minute. And you think, this is terrible. 300-year-old oak tree. Boy, if they cut that thing down, I can't put it back. This would be terrible. Then the city comes into court breathless with a picture. The picture is the oak tree is split about 40 feet off the ground, and this half is about to fall on the roof of the house next door. Oh, you didn't mention that when you came in with the emergency. Audi alteram partem. Hear the other side.
Stuart, the Associated Press, my mother was a journalist. And the creed of journalism is to be objective. What you really want to do is to really present the information as if somebody were sitting there. But let's be honest, the press, especially during the last 10 years, have been under attack, and the term fake news has been bantered around quite a bit. And to some level, some would argue that there's less trust in the press today, and that's a perception. I'll let you respond to that. So what is the Associated Press doing to help the average news consumer separate fact from fiction?
Yeah, it's certainly the case that that there has been some sort of erosion of trust, according to many studies, in the press, and it's also the case that fake news is not a new thing. So it used to be that AP would just ignore fake news. Now we're taking a much more of a robust way to try and confront it. So one example is in December 2016, AP and Facebook created a fact-checking partnership, and we're trying to do that with other organizations as well. In general, what AP has decided to do is to really reinforce some of our guiding principles. So being much more transparent, making sure it's clear what we know, what we don't know in a breaking news situation, or in a situation where there's disputed agreement and disagreement, making it easier to understand when we say that something is the case. Why is it that we know that? Is it because we witnessed it? Is it because we have a source, in which case, why is that source credible, and so on. We're also trying to make it easier. We're also listening more to our audience in a way, to see what is it that they are interested in, what kind of news are they hearing that may not be correct, that may need to be debunked. And really we're putting an emphasis on finding new ways to help people understand the news that they're seeing and the information that they're seeing. And in particular, we're experimenting with new ways to do fact-checking and debunking of information. So a lot of the time we write articles, but now we're looking at more about photos and videos and how to debunk those.
So let me ask you a tough question. You know, with the volume and the availability of news these days, also with, again, we got to get the real news. Does to some extent this new age represent an existential threat to organizations like AP?
I mean, it is very difficult, partly because of the volume of things that we have to fact check and to cope with. It's very time-consuming to actually properly research things and to do reporting and so on, and time-consuming and expensive. It's actually very inexpensive to generate huge amounts of misinformation and fake news, and so and then it's extremely expensive to then do fact-checking, to investigate it, to explain why something is or is not true, and so on. So in that way, it is a challenge for all news organizations. And I also think that the spread of the idea that there is such a thing as fake news, it does tend to undermine, it tends to reinforce this idea that all news is questionable in some way. And I think that those things are challenges for news in general.
I can see that. Now let's turn it a bit. We're talking about more in the public domain. A lot of you work for organizations where your job is to collect and collate information out there, and to some extent you have the same challenge. You just have this massive intake of information coming in there, some of which is valuable, some of which is not for your organization. You know, Mike Safar, to what extent is this a technology issue out there for organizations? I mean, I'm going to use this term very loosely. To some extent, there's so much real information and fake information internally within organizations. Is this a technology problem? Is this a process problem? What do you think?
So large organizations are dependent on what they can find out about their information. And with your talk, you talked a lot about what we would call structured data. But a lot of this crowd is also having to grapple with a massive amount of unstructured data, which is not really easily collatable. And let's say you do have it in a record system or metadata, we have not done a good job over the history of information governance, only very recently, in being able to search and analyze that content. And so I'll give you an example. If I'm looking for a way to analyze information and discover whether there is sentiment within my data. If I look at structured data, I can get pretty good numbers out of that. But with unstructured data, as you know, there are many copies of that data out there.
So is unstructured data our friend, or is unstructured data our enemy? Because a lot of this sort of flies around.
Well, it's both. I think it's difficult to analyze. If you have if you try to run an text analysis on that and say what are the most predominant terms and ask AI with it, and you don't process that information correctly, you're going to get a very skewed result, because you've got a lot of old versions of documents out there, you've got copies of it, so you have to process that data a lot before you can even use data analytics tools on it. On the other hand, a lot of that data is actually produced, especially within email. Most of our customers will find that like around 75% of the unstructured data that's produced by hand is in fact email, and that is something that is terrific from understanding the behavior within my organization, but it's also incredibly time-consuming to look at all of it. The best you can do, I mean, the most mature version of that right now is in e-discovery. But we want to bring the value of that information in other business processes other than just in lawsuits. So we would like to have those kinds of tools available to you to analyze when you're doing change management, when you're doing digital transformation. And so to be able to do that, you've got to be able to distill this, what was previously unstructured information, into some form of structured information that you can measure. And it's been difficult to measure it in the past.
Okay. So let's, yeah, please, Judge.
Something that we have in the legal system, a thing called the business records rule. It wasn't developed scientifically. It's the product of 1,000 years, roughly, of trial and error in the legal system. Basically, what it says is if you're a business and you have a record, and it's the sort of record you usually keep, we will let that record into evidence. Because the fact that you usually keep it gives it some authenticity. Now, of course, the record may be utterly unreliable. It may be complete junk. But if it's in a file drawer, we generally are going to let it in. MER can help us hugely in that regard by decluttering the file drawers.
So let me ask you this, Judge. Traditional records programs have had much better filters. You know, when everything was in paper, you were able to say, well, this is a record and we should keep it here, and this is not a record. But one of the challenges is obviously in the era of electronic information, we have emails, we have social media, we have files, and so the amount of information coming into organizations is much more difficult. And as you said, the clutter is much higher. Most in-house counsel, in my view, for example, believe that email is inherently evil. The more I'm going to have of it, the more it's going to hurt me. Is there an argument to be said, well, no, it's the opposite. Quite frankly, if I have more information, that's going to give us, albeit some of it may be, you know, questionable, and we have the right to examine that, but with more information coming in, that's an advantage from a legal perspective because there's going to be more facts to be able to support or debunk something out there. I mean, should the courts welcome the fact that more stuff is going to go into evidence?
What we're going to try to do is keep the clutter out, because we have enough to work with just dealing with the stuff that ought to be part of the decision-making process. The more junk you have in it, the harder it gets to make a rational decision. This is the whole concept of information governance, as I understand it, is the information is only useful if you can get at it and use it. And that means decluttering. I fully support cleaning up ancient emails that don't serve any purpose. I fully support deduplicating, because I've tried cases in which there were literally 3,000 exhibits, 1,500 of which were complete or partial duplicates of other exhibits. That's, you know, I get irritated at the lawyers because I think, I know it is a terrible pain for you guys to have to do this, but I would a lot rather you did this in the office than we have to do it in court. You know, a courtroom costs money that the taxpayers pay for, and if you're spending all day in the courtroom trying to figure out whether this particular exhibit is waste paper, you're not really utilizing the courtroom right.
But what about,
if you guys do that, I'm happy.
But what about the fear here that, you know, hey, we'll set up a process, but, you know, we may not get this perfect. I mean, some people are going to give you the 3,000 documents for fear of, you know, hey, I missed something or you know, some type of spoliation. I mean, as a judge, how do you react to that?
Spoliation it's a real problem, but the decisions about spoliation, which sound terrible, you know, we will take you out in the streets and burn you at the stake if you spoliate.
Do they still
The
do that?
decisions are all in contexts where it was intentional spoliation. When intentional spoliation is going on, it's pretty darn obvious. When ordinary recycling or document disposition is going on, that's not spoliation. Plus which, the outset of any lawsuit that involves a lot of data is almost always a keep your data letter, right? A litigation hold. Everybody knows what they are, everybody knows what they mean, and if the lawyers on both sides are rational, they sit down periodically and talk to each other about the litigation hold. Do we really need to keep this warehouse until the lawsuit's over, or can we get rid of it? Sane lawyers, more and more, are collaborating in the process of culling and getting rid of waste. If we have to do it in the courtroom, we can and we will. And we're certainly not going to reward deliberate spoliation. But management of a business's information should be the business's responsibility, not the court's. We're not the business, and we don't know how the business needs to work. You guys are on the spot there. We need you.
So let's circle it back around, back into the public. Professor Kosinski, you know, we hear a lot about these echo chambers. And this is one of the challenges. And to some extent, you know, we have the same problem internally with duplication and other stuff like that. But sometimes information seems to get a life of its own because it echoes and echoes and echoes. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think that my view on echo chambers is probably not the one that you know, most of the people in the audience would have, and I hope to change it. Because essentially, very much like with fake news, you hear a lot about echo chambers, and that's definitely a real phenomenon. But again, it's not a new phenomenon. We always believed in echo chambers, and you know, go back a long time. You know, I was born behind Iron Curtain. That was your perfect echo chamber. You know, everyone was reading the same newspaper. It was called The Truth, Pravda. And so all people there were living in the same echo chamber. And think about it, how it must have felt. You didn't even know there's this whole world, or you kind of heard of it, but you didn't know exactly what was there. So it felt like, well, there are no echo chambers. Everyone is essentially in the same echo chamber. And now as we're becoming more and more connected, we stay in touch with people who normally would have drifted off in our lives. If you're in touch with some of your high school friends that are living in a very different geographical space and are doing very different jobs, and normally in the past you would have lose contact with them. But these days you're connected, and from time to time you would see what they posted on Facebook. You will receive some content, some information from them. And what this essentially is someone knocking on the outside on your chamber. And by this knocking process is making this echo chamber extremely salient. You realize, oh my God, there's all of this world out there of people who disagree with me, who have very different opinions, very different views, who read very different papers and talk about different things. So I'm essentially thinking that the situation is improving, that our echo chambers are expanding. We are much better connected in the past.
So let me ask you a crazy question. Are echo chambers a good thing?
No, echo chambers. Well, echo chambers are inevitable because, as it was mentioned before, you cannot read all of the papers and you cannot access all of the information. And also, this would be ridiculous. You're interested in one thing, I'm interested in another thing. We are experts in different domains. And it's great that you can spend your time in your echo chamber and I can spend my time in my echo chamber. The same relates to non-professional interests and also political views. If someone has particular political views, it's natural for them. They will interact mostly with people who share them. Now, what's unprecedented today is an ease with which we can reach to the other side. We're one click away from virtually any type of political view or political agenda or professional view and professional agenda online. And I think this process of broadening, expanding of our echo chambers is again creating an illusion because those echo chambers start crossing with each other. People are knocking on those echo chambers from the outside, making them salient.
Well, but is there the reverse risk that, you know, I'm an information governance professional and with, you know, I like to think I'm open to other points of view and the you know, today's electronic environment allows me to be able to do that, but do I end up dealing with other information governance professionals that also like to hit Pro V1 golf balls that tend to, you know, we tend to narrow ourselves selectively? I mean, is it an illusion out there?
That's a great hypothesis, and actually I was sharing this conviction. I thought, before I looked at the data and looked at the research, I thought this must be happening, that recommender systems are just dragging us deeper and deeper into those rabbit holes. What turns out that it's absolutely not true. Really? Even with simple things, like think about music recommendation systems. The idea was that if, you know, now the system can recognize my music taste, it would just drag me into, you know, just these few bands that are kind of specific to my taste. It turns out that the exact opposite is true. When you look at data on how people listen to music, the number of unique artists and different genres that people listen to is expanding every single year. So Spotify actually published data recently. It's 15 to 20% more unique artists and more different genres.
Do you think that extends to news too? That people are
It extends to news too. When you look at people who look at mainstream, and not only mainstream media, at websites like CNN, but also Breitbart News, it turns out that in the past, those were very siloed audiences, and now with time, they're expanding. So people, to give you an example, there's this, I forgot the name of this website. It was this alt-right, extremely right-wing website, Stormtrooper. It turns out someone did analysis of the content being published there. Great majority of the links published on this website were to BBC and CNN and other mainstream media organizations. There was an environment there where people of certain political views gathered, and they were expressing their opinions and interpreting this mainstream data in their own specific way.
So they were going back to they were going to the mainstream media to validate opinions, do you think?
I would say they were essentially exposed to mainstream media, something that people on the extremes in the past did not have chance to achieve. You know, if you're born, imagine if you're born to a small, tiny political community with a particular political view or given a religious view. In the past, you were just limited to this small, tiny echo chamber of yours. Now, apart from extreme examples like North Korea or Iran, there's it's impossible to stop people from expanding their horizon, and you can see it with music, but also it turns out with views as well.
So Stuart, I was going to say a lot of people. I actually live right next to you. Silicon Valley, but I open the San Jose Mercury News, and I have an expectation when I read the San Jose Mercury News, much of which is Associated Press, that it's true. And what's my expectation, or how do you as a media firm separate true, and I know that's a relative word, maybe there is no such thing as truth, versus pure misinformation? I mean, how do you go through that task?
Yeah, I mean, so the AP looks at misinformation as being kind of a range of different things, as you're saying. There can be some things which are totally fabricated, some things which are a mixture of true and false things, and some things which are actually similar to your Stormtrooper example. They're actually true things, but can be framed in a misleading way. So I just want to give you 3 quick examples of each of those. So something completely fabricated. There was recently a story going around that the FDA was saying that diphtheria vaccines had, on their website, they were saying they had a side effect of causing autism. Totally made up. AP looked at the website. It wasn't on the website at all. We asked the FDA. They're like, yeah, no, that's definitely not true. Second example of a mixture of true and untrue things. We were looking at a story that was going around about in Texas. There was a bill introduced to restrict whether or not you're allowed to take poor people or disabled people to the polls to vote. It's true that there is a bill that's been introduced, but the restriction was if you're taking disabled people to the poll to vote, and they have to vote from the car, then you need to register in advance. So a mixture of true and untrue there, but playing on people's fears about voter suppression. And then the third one about something that was a true story, but framed in a misleading way. There was a story about Muslims attacking the police in Copenhagen. And it was a video, and it showed people, it was actually a true video. It was in fact in Algiers, and it was showing people protesting against their autocratic president, who later stepped down. But the headline that was associated with it totally mischaracterized it, playing up Islamophobia. And in some ways, the idea of websites like Stormtrooper pointing to mainstream sites, they do that, but they can also frame those stories in misleading ways. So each of those things are different kinds of misinformation. In terms of how I'd suggest people spot whether something is misinformation or not, I'd say that most news is pretty boring, to be honest. Whereas
it's not fun. I mean, if you have a splashy misinformation, you're going to get a lot more clicks.
Exactly,
than if you say, well, that's not really true.
It tends to be, right, misinformation tends to be much more emotionally engaging, whether in a positive or negative way. Like, I can't believe these people are doing this, or that's absolutely right. So my suggestion is notice if you have a very strong emotional reaction to a piece of news and double check that to see, like, can you verify that with other sources and so on, because that's more likely to be
Is it getting better or getting worse?
Well, in certain ways, there's much more incentive to promote misinformation, like through advertising and so on. But I think most people are, there's increasing awareness of it, so I think it's a balance. So I'd say it's always been around, but I think the situation overall is improving.
So Mike, I want to hear how corporations do that. Before, I would just want to get a quick comment from Judge Flynn. You know, the echo chamber effect, obviously it affects you, or sitting on the bench. I mean, how is the judiciary dealing with that?
We have a built-in bias against echo chambers because of the hear the other side principle. If we are only getting one story over and over again, the more times we hear it, the more suspicious we get that there's something being left out. This is a very helpful habit of mine. I also have a built-in filter because of the way evidence gets to me or to a jury. If you're going to introduce evidence in a court case, you're going to have to submit that evidence to cross-examination by the other side, which gets to poke at it and say, well, is this really true? How do you know that? What are you not telling me? And so on and so forth. So there's a built-in filter, something which is demonstrably nuts isn't going to get introduced because it will become clear very quickly that it's demonstrably nuts, and that will actually hurt the case of the person who's putting it in, because we'll say, well, if you're going to give me this kind of demonstrable nut information, how should we accept anything else you say? You can't undercut your own credibility by peddling junk in a courtroom. Doesn't work. So I have, in the courtroom setting, less of this problem than I do in the rest of my daily life. But there's something that's helpful to think about. It's the same kind of test that you're suggesting, I think. We have a thing called the hearsay rule, which says that we won't accept testimony about what somebody else said as true. Joe told me that the car was going too fast. We won't let that testimony in because we want Joe to be there. Why do we want Joe there? Because we want to be able to ask Joe, how do you know that? What do you mean by too fast? Where were you? Were you measuring something on a stopwatch or what? If we can't talk to Joe, then we can't poke at Joe's information, and therefore we're going to try to keep it out because we can't test it. We want to be able to test things. You and I every day deal with hearsay. Lots and lots and lots of hearsay. My mom's friend said XYZ or whatever. And we filter the hearsay that we get every day through our own tests of reliability. Which friend of my mom's? Oh, Clarice. Oh, boy, she knows what she's talking about. Yeah, Clarice is a good reporter. Okay, so I'm going to take that at face value for now. But my mom's other friend, no, I don't think so. You know what I'm talking about. You want to be able to test it. If you're getting information that you can't test, something's fishy.
So, and I just kind of add to this because it's just a wonderful piece of advice, and I just wanted to build on that. So what definitely happened in recent years is that anyone can be a publisher. Anyone can go on Twitter and tweet. Anyone can write a blog post. Anyone can put a video on YouTube. And it's not bad. We should not be afraid of that. It's creating a new situation, but allows people to express themselves. It gives freedom of expression, then also reduces the monopoly that governments all around the world or big organizations have on information. And if you don't appreciate how dangerous this monopoly can be, you clearly haven't lived in the Soviet Union or in North Korea or in Cuba. So it's all good to, in the US for most of the time. But there are definitely societies around the world where freedom of expression of every individual is extremely important. Now, the downside of it is that in the past you had credible large organizations like Associated Press or New York Times that had a lot to lose by publishing essentially an incorrect story. Now, a blogger or someone on Twitter has nothing to lose and potentially a lot to gain by publishing something that is arousing emotional response from people. But also in this world of technology, we have solutions to that. Think about eBay. You can go to eBay or to Amazon and buy something from a seller that lives in another country that you will never meet, you've never seen them, you've never seen their headquarters. And you can safely send them thousands of dollars and then be sure that your product will arrive, and the quality of service and the quality of the product is usually higher than in your corner store. And this is because those platforms develop a reputation system. They essentially you can give stars to people if the product was fine and punish them by giving them bad reviews if it wasn't. So now I would give just the following rule of thumb here, that if you would not buy a laptop from a person, of a particular person, a laptop from them, why would you believe a story they're publishing out there? So essentially check your sources. If you see New York Times or The Economist or Associated Press publishing something, those guys have a lot to lose by publishing an incredible situation. And if you have Mike666 publishing something on Twitter,
I read that, actually.
Exactly. Then treat it as reading Harry Potter and not information that you necessarily have to take us through.
Okay, so let me take this sort of societal problem, and like Safar, I'm going to make the argument that we sort of have a version of truth problem internally. Everybody can be a self-publisher, and I know one of the issues how do we know if I've got the right version of truth? Have we ever edited an Excel spreadsheet that turned out to be the wrong version or something else like that? With everybody being a self-publisher, with all this information, is there an analogy to the same societal problems of lots of information, we don't know the quality of that, to internally within corporations and for these people whose job it is to manage this information?
Yes, absolutely. When you are a large organization, if you were in the PR department or the legal department, you're faced with a crisis, what do you have to do? You want to gather the facts. Now, you may have an intention to give a spin on that's to your side, but you don't want to give a spin on something that's ill-informed, okay? Because you're going to embarrass yourself. And so how do you collect all that information? And so a lot of times people wait until the crisis and they're like, okay, give me everything you've got. Well, that may mean that I have to spend a very long time reviewing information, and I don't have it. The clock's ticking. You know, the Horizon oil well explosion is an example of that. I've got a PR crisis, and I've got several companies involved in that, and I want to get facts really, really fast. And how many of you think that out there, every one of the constituents in that had their information in an easily searchable records management system? And very unlikely. More likely, there was a lot of information in file shares that they had to go to hundreds or maybe even 1,000 custodians, gather that information, get it into eDiscovery, and try to quickly come up with some search terms around it. And so we're looking for some automation around that. That automation obviously is a lot easier if you were prepared in the first place and you had an information governance plan in place. But as we know, it's incredibly difficult to get your user population to actually use a system like that and help you codify the information up front so that when it's needed in a crisis, it's available. And so as technologists, what all of us are trying to do is come up with ways to make it easier for people to comply with providing that information and do simple things like, for example, you mentioned the spreadsheet. That's a very common problem. I edited the wrong version of it because I didn't see somebody's email. So we need systems in which will give you the very latest version, which will help you figure out that you might be editing the wrong version.
So let me give you a rough analogy. And Stuart, I'm going to use what you said. You know, the amount of fake news out there and the effort to verify it and validate it and to ensure that it's correct in terms of that, that's a hard task. And to some extent, I'm sure it feels like building sort of a sandcastle in the surf. I mean, it feels like as soon as you get one thing out, another one comes, and before you know it, to some extent, I'm sure there are people here who have the same feeling. Hey, I'm trying my best to govern my information. I'm trying to be able to do this, but quite frankly, I'm not keeping up with the volume of that, and I'm feeling like a bind of that. How should these people feel, and is there a mindset that you can give them to say, hey, you know, keep at it? I mean, the Associated Press is still doing it from an internal information point of view. You know, do we sort of say, oh, we just let it go, or how do we approach it?
Well, if we are trying to, if we're trying to pull all this information together, we don't necessarily even have it all in the same system. And so we've got different departments who are dealing with this information, and they have different points of view. Okay, you've got a problem right there. You've also got political factions within large organizations with different priorities, and they're pushing different information forward as, you know, tell me what is the real information here. And that's where, you know, we're trying to get with information governance to get more objective about the value of that information. But we can also bring some subjectivity to that in the sense that we can look at who produced it, what information is consumed most often, and allow that to color whether or not this information is the right version of it, and whether I want to reuse it, how I want to value it going forward.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Judge Flynn a question, but then I want to give you a chance to ask your questions. We have people with, so think of your questions and line up for those. Judge Flynn, this is hard.
It is.
And do you know that? I mean, when somebody comes to you and say, well, I think I have most of the stuff, or I'd be able to do that, I mean, there's this feeling that they have to be perfect, and we're going to court, and man, I'm afraid of that. How much do you
I haven't
get that?
seen perfection yet. I spent 30 years as a litigator before I became a judge. And I never had a substantial case where the day before trial, something didn't pop out of the woodwork. Usually some part of the woodwork that we thought we'd looked at before. But, you know, well, it fell out and it was in the bottom of the drawer, or I didn't look in my garage. Whatever it is. It does happen. All you can do is the best you can do. The point that I want to be real clear about here, though, is our job isn't even possible without what you do. You are absolutely the first line of management for everything really that the AP gets, that I get, that we all get. And although it absolutely is like building sandcastles in the surf. That's a great image. The tide comes in and the sandcastle falls down, and you sigh and you keep going. My hat's off to you. I am really grateful that you keep going, because if you don't, we can't.
All right, do we have any questions out there? Question?
Second. We have a microphone shortage. So we want to have a microphone out on the floor. So I'm just going to take one of these, give it to a student. So if you have a question, please just wait for the microphone
We have
so
a question
everyone
back there?
can hear it. So just wait.
It's interesting, you know, these sometimes feel like different problems, but they're not. We see a lot of parallels between that. All right, question.
So I'm going to start with you, Michael. I'm going to kind of push you to look at the others on the panelist. We've heard an awful lot about documents up there and the authenticity of documents. And I'm going to say that the idea of a document is fundamentally dying or dead, because a transaction today is fundamentally often a line in a database that occurs, and that's all that we have. You know, I look at my kids, they've never written a check in their life. It is a swipe of a card, it is a You know, it's a Venmo, it's something like that. So as we look at the authenticity, as we look at the privacy, as we look at how we authenticate that, how do we make certain that we look at those records, as we look at the transaction, that it's authentic, that it's secured, that it is valid as we move forward, that it meets the judge's need for a business record, because it isn't something that you're going to be able to hold and handle moving forward.
I mean, that's a great question. We all grew up with the idea that information is discrete. We had a document, we had a piece of paper. For the most part, it was all into it, but today's world, we just get lots of little pieces of it, and sometimes it's very transient. I think, tell me if I mischaracterized your question. How do we deal with that? I mean, do we have to rethink our paradigm of what is a document and what is information?
Well, I definitely think that we need to rethink the paradigms, and I think that you are definitely right that the world that we are living in today is fundamentally different in many ways from the world that we lived in 10, 20, 50, 200 years ago. But I also think that the fact that something is new and different from what was there in the past does not necessarily mean that it's worse. And I would say that the fact that in the past you could write a check does not, and today you just have a line somewhere in a database, does not necessarily mean that this line in a database is less secure than a check itself. We all know about how much check fraud that was going on. In order to fake a check, this is something, or fake a banknote, that was something that we know there was an entire industry set up on doing this. To fake a record in a database, on one hand it sounds terribly easy. On the other hand, given the fact that those records are multiplied over many servers, are being backed up, are being encrypted, are being copied to other organizations, there are being sums, hashes created of databases. If you change something, even if you don't know exactly what was changed in this particular copy of the database, you still have a hash that shows, well, something has been changed for sure. All of those technologies were not available to us in the past. We have blockchain technology, we have encryption technology, and so on. I think that there's essentially many more tools that we have today at our disposal to make sure that the information is not fake.
So you think authentication is actually going to get better and easier even though our information is more transient?
Oh no, there's absolutely no question about this. Look, absolutely no question about this. You can go to a store and buy something for $20,000 by showing them a piece of a plastic with a chip on it.
We got to pay that afterwards.
Well, that's true, but they trust that you are you and that the whole transaction will be covered. And also we have actually ways of retracting transactions that were proven to be fake. And there's a system of checks and balances that was absolutely not fathomable, just a few years ago.
Okay.
Can I jump in? You're absolutely right to make the point that you're making. The definition of document, even to a lawyer, no longer is limited to paper. Document is any kind of recorded information. And you all know better than I do that the ways to record information grow exponentially every day. The thing that helps us with authenticity in the modern world, and this just builds on what Michael said, is any transaction will have footprints somewhere. If something has no footprints at all, your eyebrows should go up and you should think, is this spurious? Because if it's real, it's got footprints. It's got marks here and there and elsewhere.
So we like our footprints.
We like our footprints for authenticity purposes.
Okay. And from these transactions, I want to go in the other direction and say what you said about the document being dead. If you think about it, more and more communication is moving into platforms like Teams and Slack, where the definition of a transaction evaporates. We have a subject line on an email, but in a chat, we talk about many different things. In fact, we talk about several subjects all at once. And now we have to figure out, as information governance professionals, how do we file this record when it's let's say it's a chat, what is the topic about, okay? And how do I deal with that in discovery? All of a sudden, I've created this massive redaction problem in discovery because it's not all relevant to what's going on. This is a terrible burden on us from a process perspective. We're looking to technology to try to help us figure that out, but we haven't done it yet in the context of these new collaborative platforms that are becoming so popular now over email, may overtake email in the near future.
And Stuart, I don't know if you want to have one last comment on that, and we're going to try and fit in one last question before that. News stories don't come whole news stories. We get all of our news these days also in little tiny pieces. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, you're right. News comes in all little chunks. We try to classify each of those chunks. Even within one news story, we will say this part's about this topic and this part's about this topic and so on. We need increasingly sophisticated kinds of automation to cope with that, to be able to recognize that.
How long did it take AP to get that?
Well, I mean, AP's been around for 120 years, but my department's been there for about 15 years.
And was it a cultural mind shift yet?
It is, and it's still an ongoing thing. And particularly, there was a lot of resistance initially towards promulgating news through platforms like Twitter and Facebook. That's really eroded and turned around now, where the journalists really want to get their news out to where people are reading it and watching it. And so, to some extent, that we in the technology group have had to catch up with that in order to be able to even realize that we needed to archive our Twitter, our tweets, and our Facebook notes, and so on. So it's definitely been an ongoing adjustment.
Okay. Questions? Ken Withers.
Earlier, I feigned that I didn't want to participate on this panel, so now I can't help myself. My question is, or observation, Judge Flynn pointed out very correctly that we judge in the courtroom setting, we judge authenticity and reliability in terms of probabilities. Professor Kosinski has laid out in his earlier talk the extreme power of the tools that we now have for psychological profiling. If probability is based really on our own personal experience of what we think is more probable or not, but if the information being presented to us has been carefully tailored, either intentionally or unintentionally, with regardless of motive, but has been tailored to appeal to our personality, are we entering an era where confirmation bias can be put on steroids? Because the information being presented to us, as you use the illustration of the Facebook news feed, the information being presented to us seems to be more and more tailored to things that don't necessarily outrage us, but just sort of seem right to us. In small increments, they seem right to us. And over time, it builds up that we build up a worldview based on our confirmation bias. Because we have these tools now for people to present us with information based on their view of what we want to hear. So my concern is, what is the role of information governance professionals in trying to create a more objective basis for us to analyze the information that we're getting?
That's a good question. So is this a societal problem, or is this something we can do as a profession, or give us some thoughts?
I think the answer is the reputation system. So you, as data professionals, people who look at the records for a living, you could essentially start working, and I'm sure you're working already, on systems that measure what is the probability that a given information is true, and what is the probability that a given source of information is giving you a real information. Now, interestingly, those systems, they have a tendency to become self-enforcing ones. Look, you do not really have to police eBay sellers too much. They understood what is the value of having, gazillions of 5-star reviews, the same as Uber drivers and so on, and you don't need to push them to be great.
So you think the reference model is going to help that? So let me ask this: how do we apply the reference model towards internal organizational information governance?
Let me give you a possible thought here.
Okay.
What you do is you put your thumb on the scales. The reputation model puts its thumb on the scales in the direction of consider this to be more authentic than that, if you want to put it that way. One of the classic problems in human affairs is what is a contract? Because people engage with each other in uncountable different ways, and the legal system has spent 1,000 years trying to figure out how do we tell whether this interaction between people is a contract that the law should enforce or is just a discussion? It's not easy. Well, what if, as you sort through information that's coming to you on a daily basis, you take this bit of information, which you recognize, according to the internal standards of the business, was meant to be a transaction, and you flag it, and you put it in a file that says transaction. And you take this other thing, which was not a transaction, it was a chat, and you put it in a file that says chat. A few years later, there's a lawsuit. There is an argument, did we have a deal or not? When the information is produced, and it has a transaction tag on it,
You believe it more.
a court is going to say, if the business says this is a transaction, why shouldn't we take the business's word for it? Why should we argue with how business itself does things? That works. And you can use that not just for information governance, but for information sorting and information retrieval in a way that has meaningful legal consequences. This is how the Uniform Commercial Code worked when it began. The drafters of the code said, we have this whole legal system that ignores how business people do things. That doesn't make sense. Why shouldn't we find out how businesses do things and then say, okay, that's the law? And they did.
So we tried an experiment in information governance as an industry maybe 10, 15 years ago, knowledge management. And in knowledge management, a lot of what we tried to do is identify experts, subject matter experts in different areas, and that may give you no more than a phone number to call or an email address to talk to somebody. But the idea behind it was that you could actually say documents produced by this person are of higher value to the organization than some others. Now, my observation about that is that only a very few types of organizations, like professional services consulting firms, for example, have really been able to take advantage of that. But something of that sort, I think, may become more possible through the proper analysis of how that information is, what kind of metadata is available to retrieve it, what the search is available on it, and also maybe how the HR department, for example, or other knowledge management individuals say that these are the people that are highly valued in their opinion. How it was done in knowledge management, I didn't think was necessarily a successful experiment, but I do think that it's becoming more possible now to get to that with the kind of data that we can derive from the data today.
Stuart, Myles, you get we're about out of time, so you get the advantage of the last word.
Well, thank you very much. So I think just to add to that a little bit, in certain cases, whether it's a Facebook newsfeed or a search against an e-discovery system, what you're being presented with is the information that you wanted or wanted to see, perhaps. But I think that one of the things that will be interesting to do is to understand, well, why? Why is this the answer? Why is this information? And part of it could be building on reputation and saying, because these are reputable sources. It could also be indicating, because we based it on your data that we collected about you and so on. And I think, but I think that getting to the why behind the algorithms and being able to show that to people would be a very powerful thing to do next.
Well, I've got some real news, and the real news is we're out of time. And so I want to have a big thank you for Professor Michael Kosinski from the Stanford School of Business, Judge Peter Flynn, thank you for coming here, Stuart, Myles from the Associated Press, and Mike Safar from OpenText, and also a big thank you for OpenText for sponsoring the panel. Thank you very much. That was